The woke apocalypse is upon us, and it's festering under liberal leaders everywhere. We are getting our hands on the mugshot of disgraced former Department of Energy official Sam Brinton. The non-binary nuclear waste expert is out of a job after being accused of stealing luggage in 2 different airports. Before being caught red-handed, Brinton was getting praised for being one of the first openly gender-fluid people to work in the federal government. Republicans now hope that President Biden has learned a lesson on woke hires. They are demanding answers from the DOJ, requesting an investigation into how Sam was able to get security clearances in the first place. But the Democrats' woke drama doesn't end there. In Washington state, Governor Jay Inslee held a summit that included a presentation claiming phrases such as objectivity and individualism are rooted in white supremacy culture. And Cambridge Dictionary just added a new definition of woman to be more inclusive. The definition description even swaps out the word she for they. Okay, you know what the problem is, Dana? I always feel like I'm about to get into trouble.
When you read that?
Like who, he, they, hey, she.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's start with this guy, Sam. With this they.
Yes,
Sam
they.
Brinton.
I'm
right?
gonna call.
We don't
Look,
have to play that game.
No.
We don't?
He's a criminal.
He.
Okay. Well, he's got to be convicted. But what I want to know, Dana, number one, is we don't know if he has a prior record. What we do know is that after he was arrested and made an admission as it relates to his theft of luggage in an airport, he kept his security clearance and he kept his job.
Right.
And then he's arrested for another felony.
Right.
So the question is, you know, the Department of Energy is not answering the question as to how this guy who has a security clearance, been arrested on 2 felonies, and, you know, he's presumed innocent and all that. How does he maintain his security clearance?
I'm not sure. I mean, the Office of Presidential Personnel, I think, has some answering to do. One, obviously, I don't know about a previous record, but it seems unusual that at this age, you would all of a sudden start stealing luggage off of the carts in airports.
Very good,
And
Dana. You're going to be an investigator.
I could be. I'm working on. Yes, exactly. I read all those books when I was a kid, so that seems unusual. It's not unusual that someone might lie during the vetting process in order to get an approval. But it seems to me there could have been in this case like excitement about having the first of this and the first of that and the first they, and you know when he got the job. There was a lot of celebration.
Yes.
He did a lot of social media. So he wanted attention. This is an important job, right? Any of these jobs where you have a security clearance, it's really serious. Like, if you smoke pot, you can't get a security clearance.
Right.
Right. So would you agree?
Uh-oh. Yeah,
exactly. So I am for diversity in the workplace on merit.
Right.
I think America wants a meritocracy, especially when you're talking about something that has to do with national security, or when you are raising children, teaching children in schools. And also, this is so interesting. We did this topic just the other day. I learned more about this organization called DoNoHarmMedicine.org. It is shocking what is happening in academia, but also in hospitals, in order to get even in dental's office, because in order to get your occupational license, for example, you have to do all this anti-racist training. And what this group, DoNoHarmMedicine.org, they believe that everyone needs care and that access to care is very important. Their concern is that this type of ideology is leading to negative care for people and endangering lives unnecessarily. So I encourage people to check that out. You'll be pretty shocked at some of the examples that you see. You
know, Jesse, one of the things that we heard about, I mean, one of the things that I was reading as we came into this was that Washington Governor Inslee's administration advises agencies that concepts like objectivity and individualism are rooted in white supremacy and should be rejected in favor of indigenous relational pedagogy. Yeah. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, ask the Indians if they think being objective is a white thing, or ask the Africans if they think individualism is white supremacy. I don't think Jay's ever asked one of them. This guy, Sammy Sticky Fingers, he wasn't just any transgender. He was like the sexual pioneer of transgender. You Google him, which I assume they did before hiring him. He's wearing leather. There's a leash. There's a dungeon involved. I wouldn't call it deviancy. I wouldn't call it perversion. Let's just say he's sexually adventurous. And when you are in that world that he's in, and he's deep, you can be blackmailed. Easily blackmailed. And now if you have a security clearance, remember how Jared Kushner had a hard time getting a security clearance?
Yeah.
Jared Kushner, the whitest, most proper conservative, doesn't drink, buttoned up, look, very patrician. He was having a hard time. This guy has a security clearance. That's how insane this was. So they didn't vet this guy, but that doesn't shock me because they didn't vet the Afghans. They were clinging to the planes in Kabul. Hey, yeah, come in, Mohammed, whatever. Could be Al-Qaeda, could be ISIS. Hop on board. We're going to fly you to Michigan. Or what about all these illegals?
How about the southern border?
They're not vetting anybody. They're not vetting anybody on our border, anybody overseas, and they're not vetting these guys. Now, who else are they letting in? That's what I'm worried about. That's the point. And if you can't run the administration properly, you can't run the country properly. Johnny actually went out on the Cambridge thing and he asked regular New Yorkers, what is the definition of a man? What is the definition of a woman? And these are liberal New Yorkers, and even liberal New Yorkers know this is, as you would say, Judge, hogwash.
Hogwash, that's it, baby. Not baby, you're not my baby.
Hey,
that's
babe.
it. All right, you know what? The truth is, Brian, that when you've got these people who are absolutely insistent on, being gender fluid, as this guy is. He's not one or the other. He's just non-binary, gender fluid, dresses the way he feels. I guess it's okay. We'll ask Jessica in a minute. But, they start advertising for the CIA. I am a a gender fluid individual, and I'm intersectional, bipolar, and, with people who are pilots in the airlines as well. And when I think back to the last year, it's like merit doesn't matter anymore. Like Kamala Harris, obviously merit didn't matter in her selection. That was political identity and nothing else. That can't do anything to help this country.
I don't envy you hosting this block. This is the craziest thing. Here's why. Because none of it makes any sense. I don't think anybody agrees with this. And Jesse, I'm going to challenge you. I think he's the only person, or she is the only person that can't be blackmailed. He posted all the worst pictures you could possibly have.
He's like Hunter.
Yeah, you can't blackmail him. He's already blackmailed himself. You got him. There's no way they check this guy out. If they did check it out, and they should pursue this, you just say, listen, and all this stuff is posted, and you go, you're the guy who should handle nuclear waste. You'll be perfect. You're only 35 with not much of an energy background and tend to spend a lot of time in different outfits. So good job. By the way, stealing, I've never even heard of that.
Talk
stealing
about
luggage.
waste. I mean, this guy takes suitcases.
He's going to be looking at 10 years in jail.
Too.
So he gets the job of a lifetime, and he rewards himself and the people that put him there by stealing luggage and getting arrested and embarrassing everyone. I think 99% of the people watching us who have a television think this is crazy town, and objectivity and individualism is not white supremacy.
Can I make just one more point before you go to Jesse? Because he is a political appointee, so he's not protected by the career civil service rules. You serve at the pleasure of the president. You could be fired for saying hello the wrong way to the president, and you could be out. So the fact that they didn't fire him immediately, even after he was arrested, is an issue.
Yeah, and so I guess the question, Jessica, is if it is all about wokeness over competence, it puts America in a tough situation. And if senators are writing to the Department of Energy and asking for answers on how they vet their employees, and they're not getting answers after a third letter, I mean, can the administration just hide and say, we're not going to tell you? This is an important position.
Oh, I totally agree on that front. And I thought that Senator Barrasso, who's kind of been leading the charge on the Republican side, has done a really good job in asking questions about this. Hasn't mentioned once that this is a gender fluid person or talked about pronouns. This is about national security. And that's where this conversation should be, and that's where it should stay. In terms of just making wokeness appointments, I would push back heartily against the idea that Kamala Harris and this person are comparable in any way in terms of getting their position. And I know how you feel about her, but that woman is qualified for this job. And everybody who wins an election, runs for election, is picked for a position, has certain attributes. And yes, it does matter that she is a black woman, the same way that it mattered that Mike Pence was a white evangelical when Donald Trump picked him up, because he couldn't have won that voting block. And I
don't think those color of his skin got Mike Pence the job. You think
no, his religion, because Donald Trump, 50-time philanderer after the you-know-what tape, needed some help with people of faith, right, who weren't interested in voting for someone like that. So I just want to stop diminishing Kamala Harris.
No,
in terms of,
I won't.
No.
But you can say she's great. I'm not going to stop. The woman can't say anything competent without laughing.
So Bill Maher and Barack Obama have been talking about this, making people feel bad about when they don't know what to say, right? About pronouns, or just don't make people feel bad about things. That also, on the flip side of that, it doesn't take that much to find out how somebody wants to be addressed. And if you do know that, do not intentionally make fun of them or challenge the way that they live for your own comfortability. No one should be made to feel bad about it. Like you said, I'm nervous to say X, Y, Z.
I am nervous because you get criticized.
I said no one should be made to feel bad if they're making a genuine effort to treat people with respect and dignity.
Okay, how about this? I identify as a doctor. Refer to me as Dr. Waters.
Fine. PhD or medical? I'm PhD. Are you
Dr.
going
Waters.
medical?
Oh,
I'm going to call you that, but I'm not going to
operate
remember
all
what
over
you
you.
said. You were like, I can deliver a baby. Right. No one's going to let you do any of that.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Kilmeade. I want you to do me a favor. I want you to click to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page. This is the only way that I know for sure that you're not going to miss any great commentary, any great news bites, any great interviews coming your way on Fox. You can get it all here on YouTube. So subscribe right now.